Hello everyone, I'm Instructor Hollon, and this lecture is on natural law and the theory of human rights. So natural law ethics is closely associated with Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. And so for information on the Summa, see DeMock and Fisher 2017, pages 65 to 78. So what Aquinas did was he distinguished between four different types of laws. All right. So the first is the eternal law. The second is natural law. The third is the human law, and the fourth is the divine law. All right. So four types of laws on Aquinas' system, and the eternal law represents God's mind or God's intentions. Okay. Natural law is the law found then in nature. Human law will be man-made laws made by human beings, and the divine law is the law revealed to us in revelation. Okay, uh, think of the concept of revelation in a revealing in, say, religious traditions or something, right? Of importance then are the roles of eternal and natural laws on this theory. Okay, so there's kind of a coincidence. Okay, there's natural laws, but then there's also kind of the eternal law that maybe on some ways of thinking fixed the natural law. Okay, now this we'll see later that this might create some problems for natural law theory, but it's really not essential to the theory of natural law that there be an eternal law that governs natural law. Okay, but that's the system that Aquinas used and developed. Okay, so for example, the think of for natural law, think of the Greek conception of a telos. Okay, the Greeks, like Aristotle, had thought that things have a natural kind of function or purpose. Okay, um, and so here, by example, you would use something. You could think of something like an acorn. The telos of an acorn, its purpose is to grow into an oak tree. Okay, or the telos of an eye is its function or purpose is to see, right? A rat will is for the telos of a rat is for eating. That's about all rats do, and so on. Okay, so the idea here is that things in nature have natural that have some kind of function or purpose that's fixed by its nature. Okay. Aristotle used examples of things like spiders and such. He thought that spiders had no intelligence, no brains, no minds to speak of. But they still know how to spin webs that are intricate and have a purpose. They're designed, obviously, and have a function. They capture uh, flies and such for the spider to eat. What we know now is that the spider, in fact, does have a brain that's it's like just it's spread throughout much of its body, though not like our brains, right? But still, it's hard to think that we don't think there's much intelligence there. Okay, nothing comparable to rational, sentient, and intelligence like human beings or something, right? Higher order animals. But nonetheless, this does make sense of some purpose of how a spider can create a web to begin with. Okay, but Aristotle's thinking of examples like that. Okay, so you could probably find some better examples for him there. Again, the acorn one works fine. There are also, in addition to natural laws or the function or the something's ability to fulfill the God's plan or the eternal law, right? There are other rules or laws. And so in this case, think of some like human laws, think of things that are made for playing games or something like Cluedo. There are rules by which people must play. But who made those rules? Well, we did, right? We made the games and we made the rules. So that's a good analogy for human laws. And these are the kind of laws that you write down. right? Think of in how lawyers work with all the volumes of precedent, case precedents, and laws with which they were able. We write those laws down, but there are also additionally unwritten laws or internal laws that are not written down. Um, so, for example, the logical law that a true explanation cannot be both true and false at the same time. Well, some of those kinds of laws then will be things that we don't have to write down. Even at some point in time now, at this point, because of the study of logic, we have identified and written down, tried to identify and write down some of these laws that govern a valid reasoning, right? But these laws are known apart from checking books, or can be known apart from checking books. Okay, so those kinds of laws then will be the closest to natural laws. Okay, um, conceptually, if you think about it in terms of the examples I gave, all right. So natural laws are things that we don't have to look to for which we don't have to look to books to find out about, that we should be able to know about internally, and they're independent of our say so, right? Uh, and so that's one way to kind of think about the concept of natural laws on Aquinas' system. So um, for Aquinas, the chief natural law is the pursuit of good and the avoidance of evil. Okay, very simple summary of the natural law. Pursue good, avoid evil. Well, you might think that's not really very informative, but we'll look at problems with natural law next week. And so, and for this week, we'll look more at expositing and just understanding the theory. Okay. But note this here that this in Aquinas' formulation, there was a very simple formulation of the overall aim of natural law and such, and you might think that just requires some unpacking. Okay, so Aquinas said this basically this fundamental law is unpacked in 4 different precepts. Okay, 1, protect and preserve human life. Yeah, the biological function of life is inherently something we should preserve then on Aquinas' way of thinking. Okay, well, if it's living, we're living, there's a purpose to life. We should preserve that, all right? Notwithstanding cases, criminal cases or something like that, just naturally, generally. Okay, life should be respected. That's the idea, right? Also, the second precept, reproduce and educate one's offspring. All right. Well, this is a very easy. This goal or aim is easy to understand, especially for modern biologists and evolutionists. We think the biological function or purpose of life is to procreate. Now, that's kind of a truncated view, but in evolutionary theory, I guess that's all we're looking at. And in physical anthropology, I guess those are the only things at which we're looking, really, right? But we could see how you would think there's more than just procreation involved. But at rock bottom, we could say biologically, we all have these natural drives, and it looks like the function of our non-vestigial organs, relationships, and so forth is to procreate. And thank goodness none of us would be here if we stop, right? So this looks like some aim, a precept then for natural law. Okay, so the third precept is know and worship God. Okay, now you see how Aquinas brings in his theism here. All right, now this is not a necessary feature of natural law, but it's important for Aquinas' theory. Okay, the fourth precept is live in a society. So there's something really important about human relationships and community and society in Aquinas' system. And you could see how this relates to Plato's theories about politics in general. Aristotle. Aristotle's theory about the importance of politics. Aristotle felt that politics was the divine science, okay, one of the most important sciences of the human endeavor. Um, uh, so remember, Aristotle has a big influence on Aquinas. Okay, Aquinas calls him the philosopher, so we could see a connection there. Aristotle also thought that if you could live apart from society, if you could just go off on your own into the forest or something, you were either a madman or a god, right? And we think of like the reclusive hermit or something who spends too much time in seclusion. We think that they go. It might. We see this in movies a lot where people go insane from from solitary confinement, just from the solitariness of being alone. There's the risk of insanity, or you might be some unnatural, super powerful being to be able to live on your own like that, right? And Alan Moore's famous story, the Watchmen comics that that he made famous. He wrote, won the Hugo Award for it. One of the characters, Doctor Manhattan, is a super powerful being, and he eventually just goes off into space by then, so he doesn't need any other relationships, right? And so that's the kind of idea that if you could live like that without any relationships, you would be a madman or a god, something like that. Well, the idea, though, Aristotle's Aquinas saying is we're not like that. We do need each other, and we need society. Okay, we're a part of society and a community. Okay, so this is very important for him in his fourth precept of the natural law, summed up in pursue good and avoid evil. For more information on those precepts, see Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, pages 67 to 68. So Aquinas thinks that these precepts can be discerned by the use of reason. Okay, and they capture our essential functions in order to live well as members of our species. Unlike scientific laws, these laws are prescriptive and not descriptive. Okay, that distinction goes back to our discussion of the human, the Azad fallacy. It's fairly easy to grasp the distinction between a prescription, saying something about how things should be or ought to be, versus a description, just saying something about how things are, right? So in addition to Aquinas' system, there are also non-theistic versions of natural law today. These theories identify a common human nature and telos, then, again, a biological purpose, only they ground its aim in nature alone and not in God's mind, or not in an eternal law. Remember, I mentioned that on Aquinas' view, the eternal law and the natural law are related, but that the eternal law doesn't seem necessary really for the system once you have a natural law, right? Maybe Aquinas thought that you needed the eternal law to get to the natural law, to create it in some way, or that there was some dependency relationship there or something. But for non-theists, you don't need that relationship, and you can still recognize or identify biological functions and purposes in nature anyways. Okay, so this is precisely what non-theistic versions of natural law do. They identify the purposes and functions of nature, of things, entities, whether they're beings or properties of things, right, in nature. Okay, so this is where the language of something like Mother Nature comes in. We might use this language metaphorically or something like that, obviously. But then the idea is that nature sets its own natural law, and we just refer to it characteristically as a loving mother or something like that, having determined these laws or these aims for us. Okay. So, for example, assuming the theory of evolution, it still makes sense to speak of the function of a heart. The function of the heart is to circulate blood throughout the body. Now, whether we think that arose by accident or not, it still has a function. Okay, so this is why the theory of evolution is consistent with natural law. All right. In the same manner, theorists, just like we identify functions of hearts, then, or our eyes, theorists, non-theistic theorists of natural law identify functions for human beings as well, and that function might be something like, again, procreation. It's very, very minimalistic, but at least they can say there is something there. All right. So one version provides an evolutionary explanation of natural law, and for information on this view, see Klenk's writing Evolutionary Ethics in Matthews, 2020, pages 75 to 88. Okay, so I want to segue now into discussion of the theory of natural rights, which is related to the theory of natural law. So closely related to the theory of natural law is the theory of human rights. This theory says that there are natural human rights that ground moral decisions. Locke developed a theory of human rights in his second treatise of civil government, and he claims that people have a right to things like life, liberty, and property. Now, Jefferson appropriated this further in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. People have the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. There's a direct correlation there, and this is fairly clear today. No one disputes this. And for more discussion of the relationship between Locke and Jefferson, see the supplemental reading this week by Stern, John Locke, and the Declaration of the Declaration of Independence. I've provided that because I think it's a fascinating read, and you might be interested in seeing the relationship between Locke's theory of natural rights and its influence on some of our founding fathers, for example. So the theory of natural human rights is based on the theory of natural law, that there's some kind of purpose or grounding of purpose and functioning in the human being itself, right? And so what connects everyone then is the idea. The reason this applies to everyone is because we all have the same nature. Okay, so what makes us human, what makes you human, and what makes us all human is this shared common nature. And since we all have that, if we ground the ethics and the natural law in that, then it applies to all of us. That's how the reasoning goes. Okay, um, so people have fundamental moral rights by their very nature. Okay, now one crowning achievement of rights ethics is the UN Declaration of Human Rights, also linked this week in the written lecture, and engaging with the multimedia link this week. I recommend giving that a browse when you can. So one way to think of a difference between natural law and natural rights is that natural rights um, builds on natural law, okay, and is actually that and is can be what you think of as more precise, right? They natural rights address more precise matters, and we can formulate rights based on our understanding of natural law, and we can come to some agreement about these entitlements and rights. But natural law alone leaves those open, so to say, so that it's not clear whether something is or is not a right if you're thinking in terms of natural law alone. And this is where human reasoning can come into enters the discussion, and we see thus more distinction, a fine-grained application of natural law to this concept of rights. All right, so we get a greater list of rights, entitlements that human beings possess by nature, in contrast to something in natural law alone. Okay, that's just one way to help think about a difference between the two because of their great similarity. Right, it can be hard to distinguish any differences given the strength of their similarities. So I just point that out to help draw a distinction for you there. So in addition to the assigned reading from the textbooks that I've mentioned, some are further listed in the lecture this week, and I've also included some multimedia. I recommend taking advantage of the source material and using it while you can to help learn the material. And feel free to drop by office hours or to send me an email with any questions you might have, or raise any questions in discussion forum again. If you have any questions about natural law or rights ethics, I'm happy to answer them, and we'll pick up next week with evaluation and criticism of natural law and natural rights. Thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.